welcome to my screen recording for week 2. I thought I would take this opportunity to showcase where I started the week in terms of working in the processing program and then where I ended the week. So I did get the processing program installed correctly and did a couple of sample files, and everything was working well. So I went ahead and followed the directions in the book for creating your own monster / robot / some kind of creature, shape, being that we can continue on with throughout the rest of the chapters as we're learning. And so I sat down with my sketchbook initially, and I sketched out my little monster here. You can see him attempted to figure out different coordinates that I would be putting into the program on paper and all of that first. And this was a good exercise. I'm glad I went through it because I was having trouble kind of figuring out how this was going to translate actually onto the computer. So I took all of that information, input it into the processing program. Everything looked good. I didn't have any syntax errors that were popping up. And so then I hit run for the first time and was pretty excited to see what was going to happen. And I ended up with the world's smallest monster. Really cute. It appears to be similar to what I had sketched and what I was hoping for, but very, very tiny. So that was my very first attempt. So then I realized, of course, I need to work on figuring out how to scale up this monster / robot. So I did not go back to the sketchbook for the second time because it wasn't doing me a whole lot of good. I still wasn't really understanding how to take what was in my sketchbook from a 1-to-1 scale on the paper up to like 10-to-1, maybe 20-to-1, something like that. So I took the time to do all of this part in my head, which was exhausting. But I'm really glad that I took the time to do it because this second iteration of my monster / robot was where I really started to figure out what was actually happening when I type all of this in the processing program, what was ultimately going to be spit out. You also see in the second iteration, I've started to include comments. So we've got comments for, things like this is the color of my background and this is where I've set all the stroke colors and weights unless I changed it later, so on and so forth. So once again, everything was looking good, was pretty excited to try it and see what was going to happen. And I also included a print line on this one so that I could make sure it was working appropriately. I'm an adorable little monster. And when I hit run, I ended up with a real monster scaled up. So I was pretty excited. I haven't done any kind of coding in many, many years. I've never done any kind of programming language. This is the very first time. So I was very excited to get to this point. But I decided I wanted to push it a little bit further and just kind of see where I could go. So I went back to the sketchbook and decided that this was the scene I was going to try to recreate for our week 2 project. And I knew that I was going to have to go back to the book and use the reference function to look up a lot of these different elements, how I was actually going to type them out and make them work. That was a really good challenge, and let's see where we got. So I was able to use, I think a 20-to-1 grid in my sketchbook, if I remember correctly. I was able to get it sketched out in my sketchbook pretty close to the scale that I wanted it. Occasionally I would have to move some coordinates here and there when it was actually on the screen. I have a much better command of comments in this particular program, different pieces of information for me later just to remind me, hey, this is how we define a rectangle. If you have any rounded corners, that's what the 5th number is. Circles are set by the center, etc., etc. And I have this whole program broken down into different sections. So this is my first robot and all of its information, a white background, my second robot, etc., etc. And then all the way at the end, I do have a print line for the peeking robot, which you'll see in a second. Hey, what's going on in there? So I will now hit run and show you my raving robots. I think it's kind of funny that the print line pops up after the whole program runs. But anyway, so yeah, I'm really happy with where I ended up at the end of this week 2 project. This really pushed me and stretched me in terms of figuring out different shapes, parameters, how to code them, how to get them in the appropriate order to make sure everything shows up in the right spots and at the right time, and certain elements on top of others and all of that. There are certainly some things that I will update, that I will change throughout the weeks. For example, he probably needs an arm going to his hands over here, so you kind of understand a little better that those are his hands. If it was really a rave, these guys would probably actually be in the dark. So I may take the time to figure that out as the weeks go on as well. But I am very happy with where I ended up for the end of week 2.